Colleagues, it's a great honor to moderate a discussion with such an outstanding group of experts. And I can say that restoration of Russian-Israel relations 30 years ago was a great event. By the way, I was very well acquainted with Alexander Bovin, the first ambassador of the new Russia to Israel. We have repeatedly discussed Russian-Israel relations with him. It was really very, very interesting. To be honest, the last 30 years have only been an episode in the history of relations between Russia and Israel. But this episode is very, very important. And my first question is for you colleagues. What are the most important results of the last 30 years, in your opinion? And I would like to ask Ambassador Regev to start our discussion. What do you think about Russian-Israel relations? Honestly, I have a lot of doubts about bridge between West and Russia, but it's an important element of our relations. Okay, floor is yours, please.
So thank you. I'm very pleased to be the person opening the discussion. I never considered myself an expert on Russia-Israel relations, but I will say the following. I accompanied Prime Minister Olmert on his trip to Moscow. I think it was 2007. I accompanied Prime Minister Netanyahu on some of his trips to Moscow for meetings with President Putin. Obviously, I wasn't at the last meeting between Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and President Putin. I think it's important to have historic perspective. People of my generation, I remember as a teenager growing up and hearing that Israel Air Force was in dogfights with the Russian military in the Suez Canal. Yes, as a child, I grew up, relations between Israel and what was then the Soviet Union, we were shooting at each other, very, very hostile. I remember being aware of anti-Semitic campaigns, official campaigns run by the Soviet government, not just anti-Israel, but also anti-Semitism. And then you think where we are today in Russian-Israel relations, it's a revolution. It really is a revolution. And I think if we are objective about the situation, Israel is in the West. There's no question about that. We are very, very close with the United States. The United States is our most important partner. We have a relationship with NATO. Israel is not neutral. We are in the West. But of all the countries that have a close working relationship with the United States of America, I have no doubt that Israel has the most intense and the most intimate relationship with Russia. And we have seen this established at the very top. I remember President Putin's trip to Israel. I think it was 2004 or 5 when he met with Sharon. He has been back here many times since, most recently in January of this year when he came for the anniversary for the liberation of Auschwitz, 75th anniversary. And he was one of the many world leaders who came, but he was one of the more prominent, obviously. But we have built a relationship with Russia, which is very, very, very interesting. Once again, Israel is clearly in the West, but of all Western countries, as I say, we have the closest relationship with Russia. This has advantages, many strategic advantages, which I'm sure we will discuss, but there is also blowback. And if you are interested, I will share later with you, when I was in London, there was the incident in 2018 with Skripal in Britain, where Russian and British relations went very, very low into a crisis. And Britain expected all its allies to act in a certain way. And Israel chose not to act in the way that Britain requested. And I remember having to navigate a difficult time, but Israel made a choice. And for us, our special relationship with Russia in the framework of being a Western country is very important for our national security.
Thank you. I would like to say that generally Russian public opinion in general pro-Israel, and it's positively disposed toward Israel. It's interesting because maybe now, last 30 years, from my point of view, Russian-Israel relations maybe not very good, but from my point of view, not bad. not bad. It's very interesting. And Russian sympathy to Israel is very clear, and especially in Russian elite. It's interesting too. But I would like to ask Professor Barabanov, what do you think about it? What could we achieve?
Yes, I agree with the previous speaker that we have a kind of revolution in contemporary post-Soviet relations between Israel and Russia. That's true, the relations became much better. But just to say one word, the diplomatic relations were restored not by the independent Russian Federation, but still by the USSR in October '91. And Ambassador Bovin was the first and the last ambassador of the USSR to Israel, and then the first ambassador of the new Russia. So the situation was changing at the last years of the Soviet Union as well. And for now, I think that because I understand that our panel is in the framework of the global relations to our bilateral contacts. But I think what I'll speak about, it's also of global importance, at least for Russia. First of all is the policy of historical memory, because now we see what I would say the global wars of history on the Second World War, on other aspects, on communism, and so on. And Russian relations with many Western countries are not bad only politically, but also bad historically. We still continue these history wars with Poland, with Baltic states, with the US as well, because who of the allies was the most important in the allies coalition in the Second World War, were it the Soviet Union or the United States? And in that sense, Israel is one of the closest allies, I would say, in that sense, of Russia, because the Israeli approach to the Second World War, understandably deeply connected with the Holocaust and all these German atrocities, and the recognition of the Soviet and the Red Army affairs is very deeply positively appreciated by the Russian leadership, by the Russian elites, because this question of the historical memories became for Russia one of the global, really one of the aspects of our global strategy to show our strengths and our goodwill in history. And in that sense, Russia-Israel history relations focused on the Second World War are, and I repeat, are deeply appreciated in Russia. The second point, we also understand, and I agree with the ambassador, that Israel is in the Western larger coalition, that the United States is the major partner of Israel in the security sphere. It's understandable. And also, nevertheless, I'd like to say that we both, Russia and Israel, we found a kind of a niche for our security dialogue, for our security relations. If we look onto Syria, for example, I would say personally, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel so, that we are conducting a kind of parallel wars in Syria. And so the main idea, the main focus in our approaches to Syria is not to create additional problems to each other. And Israel is making a campaign for achieving its goals in Syria, Russia as well, and the relations are not interfering mainly with each other. Previously, it was also funny when I was preparing to this panel now, I read some articles of Russian and Israeli journalists on Syria, and it was interesting that previously, after every Israeli strike on Syria, the Israeli ambassador in Moscow was summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry, and he received the formal note of protest. But in the last couple of years, this practice ceased, and I've read the interview of the current Israeli ambassador in Moscow who confirmed this. So in that sense, the parallel wars in Syria, I think it's a good achievement for us being, frankly speaking, in the opposite geopolitical blocks. The same, to some extent, to a lesser extent, I understand it, but to some extent is for our relations towards Iran. That I think that both Russia and Israel agree to disagree on the Iranian question. We have quite opposite strategies towards Iran, but that doesn't affect our general relations. And the last point is there were many talks, many speculations that after the fall of the Benjamin Netanyahu government, the relations could become worse because everybody knows the good personal relations between Netanyahu and Putin and more than 10 years of continuous cooperation. But now we can say that the relations became stable. There were visits of the Prime Minister Bennett. There were visit and several talks of the new Israeli foreign minister with the Russian foreign minister. And the relations does not become worse as it used to be in the Netanyahu times. It means that we have already the objective base for our relations. And the change in government, the change of political coalitions will not influence sharply these decisions. If I may compare, I understand it's not, maybe not for 100% correct comparison, but we can compare this objective base for Russia-Israel relations to Russian relations, let's say, with Italy or Germany, because whatever government is in power in Italy or in Germany, in general, their bilateral relations with Russia are quite constructive. And it depends exactly on the objective base, both politically and economically. And I think that we now have the objective base for long-term constructive relations between Israel and Russia. And that is really a revolution comparing with 30 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. I would like to say that, unfortunately, Omicron is a new terrible obstacle on the way of our cooperation. Israel borders are closed now again. But, Professor, you mentioned global relations, and I would like to ask Ambassador Jeffrey about role of Great Third. Great Third is United States, a very important force in this region, and visible and invisible point in Russian-Israel triangle, if you like. What do you think about contemporary situation and future and obstacles on the way of our cooperation in this region?
First of all, I'd like to thank Daniel and the INSS for inviting me today, and I'm glad to see you all. Just a few initial remarks. One is the United States recognizes that Russia is an important player in the Middle East and has been for a long time. Its military, particularly nuclear weapons capability, its long-term relationship with Syria, its role as a major hydrocarbons producer, and its relationship with OPEC, and several other elements, including its ties that we just heard described with Israel, as well as certain other countries in the region, Turkey, again, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, make it one of the more significant outside forces in the region. Now, the question that the United States has is, what is Russia's goals in the region? We feel that we are in a competitive situation with Russia, different than, and I would distinguish the competitive situation we feel we are in with Russia, in Russia's near abroad in Europe, and different from the very significant problems we have in our bilateral relations, independent of the others. That is, we have worked with Russia, Syria is a good example, over the last 3 administrations on various ways to, I won't say go as far as end that conflict, but I would say to clarify positions on the conflict, to achieve limited deconfliction and other tactical goals, and generally to build up communication and trust. I see Israel as having done that to a far more significant degree than we have, but that makes sense because Israel's military operations in Syria are very different from ours. They take place in close proximity to Russian forces. They're against a de facto ally of Russia's, at least in Syria, Iran, and there are obviously complications, and it's a very interesting relationship to see carry on. In terms of the overall strategic situation, Israel finds itself, and I'll let the Israelis talk in more detail about this, increasingly under pressure from one country, Iran. My prediction is that the breadth and depth of Russian-Israeli relations, however good the communications at the presidential level, and they're really good, they have been really good, the nature of that relationship will be overshadowed by the situation vis-a-vis Iran and Israel, because for Israel, it's an existential issue, and for Iran, it's an ideological cause. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Professor Shelah about further the above, what are the problems that hinder the improvement of relations between Russia and Israel, or maybe not improvement, I mean progress, planning of future, and so on and so on. What do you think about this?
First of all, thank you for making me a professor. I'm not there yet, but you know, there's still time. We're all young. Maybe I'll get there. But as a former member of Knesset and member of the Defense and Foreign Relations Committee, and also I was on several delegations that had talks, including in Moscow, with our peers in both houses, parliament houses in Russia. I was able to hear their point of view, and I think the question is not of conflicts, and I think this was well expressed by the previous speakers. The question is to me a question of breadth. That is, how broad do we want those relationships to be? Where can we take them beyond the immediate scope? And the immediate scope, as well expressed before me, is the tactical scope. There are good connections. You know, there's a red phone line, what we call a red phone, where and an IDF officer picks up the receiver, and there's a Russian officer on the other side of the line, and it helped, except for one notable case, it really helped deconfliction and helped us avoid what could have been a very stressful situation for both countries. But the question is, does it stop there? Because Russia is a global force, because Russia is a global entity. Russia has interests that go way beyond this region. And Israel, being a regional power, I won't say more than that, but the regional power. The question is, where and how do we take this to the next step? Now, for I think on the Russian side, and of course you will be able to describe it better than I do, a lot of it had to do with seeing Israel, right or wrong, as a sort of gate to Washington. And this came to the fore in something that became public, and this was an exchange between the Russian NSC head, Mr. Patrushev, and the head of the Israeli NSC, Meir Ben Shabbat, who's with us now with the INSS, and the Russian way, and I won't get into the details of it, but what the Russian Mr. Patrushev conveyed was, we'll be able to expand the field, including, of course, Iran, which is, as all of you have mentioned rightly, which is so far, and this could change in the future, but so far has mutual interests with Russia in Syria. If you want us to expand it, then maybe what we need is an expansion on the American side. And but that never went beyond that. And to me, the question is, are Israel and Russia ready to expand those relationships even further? Because if we keep it to the tactical regional level, to the question of how do we avoid conflict in Syria, well, we've shown over the past 6 years that we can do that and quite effectively. And of course, and you talked about personal relationships. I think both Russia and Israel are way beyond that. You know, we see things according to our interests, and also you got to remember when you talk about the ties between Russia and Israel that there are over 1 million people living in Israel who came from the former USSR, most of them from Russia, and they form an integral and very important part of the fabric of Israeli life. So our level of understanding, our level of communication with Russia has changed dramatically since the times of the USSR and the real division that stood between us. So are we ready to go to the next step? Hopefully we are, because I think that could serve the interests of both countries. I think it could help Russia, stabilize what it wants to achieve in this region, and also build a more comprehensive relationship both with Israel and with Israel's allies in the West. And it would definitely help Israel because Russia, once again, touches upon many things, many interests that we have in the world. Are there discussions going on about it as we speak? As far as I know, not, and it hasn't happened, or it hadn't happened during the days of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Notwithstanding his good personal relationship with President Putin, I think we should go there, both sides, and I think it would serve not only us, but stability in the Middle East and in other regions as well.
Thank you very much indeed. I just mentioned that if somebody looks like professor, speaks like professor, it means
I'll take it. Thank you.
At the same time, you were a member of Knesset. It's double professor or triple. It was. Tom, you don't need questions. You know everything. I'm absolutely sure. But anyway. But seriously, it's very interesting situation. A lot of risks, a lot of opportunities, and I think that, of course, there are a lot of countries in the world, but it seems to me Russian-Israel relations is important element of contemporary world, and in some sense crucial point. And I know you have written article about triangle. What do you think about possible future?
Thank you, Andrei. I think that's a very good question. You know, at the beginning of this discussion, you cast some doubt on the ability for Israel to act as a bridge between the United States and Russia. And I'd like to address that issue in a few minutes. And I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues on the panel have to say in reaction. I think we'll remember back in June of 2019, Israel actually hosted a trilateral meeting at the National Security Council advisor level for one day in Jerusalem. This dialogue came at a time of increased tensions between the United States and Iran. And not surprisingly, Iran was a focus of much of the discussion. Now it's clear that there was no meeting of the minds during these discussions, but what was at least reported publicly, all the sides, including the United States National Security Advisor, the Russian Security Council Secretary, thought that the discussion had been useful, at least in clarifying positions and providing a better understanding of what the possibilities were going forward for US-Russian interaction in the region. And of course, for Israel, this was a major coup, I would argue. It allowed Israel to play a role, not only in the regional level, but I think more broadly in bringing the United States and Russia together for discussions. And it enhanced Israel's diplomatic standing throughout the region, and indeed more broadly than that. Now, I think this was a good undertaking, but there was no follow through to it, in part because the American National Security Advisor was ousted a few months after that meeting. We got into a series of electoral politics in Israel that precluded a follow-on meeting. Now, the question is whether it makes sense to move in that direction at the current moment. It's clear that the relationship between the United States and Russia is adversarial. The relationship is one where we're divided by our worldviews, geopolitical interests, and values. And the most that you could hope for, I would argue, in the relationship between the United States and Russia at this time is some effort to manage the competition responsibly and then find some few areas where we can cooperate. Preventing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, for example, maybe dealing with climate change and so forth. This is akin to the détente that we pursued in the 1970s, but there's a significant difference between that period and now. And that is that the world of 1970s was bipolar. That's clearly not the way the world operates today. We're moving towards a multipolar, polycentric world. And it's also clear that the US-Russian relationship doesn't define the international system today as it did 30 or 40 years ago. The main axis of international development is actually US-China at this point. But I think what this means is that, that the US-Russian relationship can no longer be thought of as simply a bipolar context. And that means that the diplomacy between our two countries cannot simply be bipolar or bilateral. The bilateral relationship needs to be embedded in a broader multilateral relationship. And you've seen the United States and Russia over the past several years engage in what I would call ad hoc coalitions of the necessary on specific problems. Probably the prime example of that for the region that we're discussing now is the P5+1 to deal with the Iran nuclear issue. But I think that in the current circumstances, that it makes sense to expand these multilateral coalitions, to make them routine, to have them discuss strategic issues and regional security architecture. Now, I think it's clear that you can't do this at the official level. I see no real interest in Washington or Moscow for a trilateral discussion with the Israelis about the broader Middle East, but certainly at the expert level, we ought to be able to do this. And in many ways, Israel makes an ideal partner for these discussions and a way of moderating perhaps the competition between the United States and Russia. We know that Israel is a leading power in the Middle East, probably the best military, the most complex and diversified economy. It's beginning to develop relations with the more moderate Arab states. And so it's in a position, I think, to reach out to both Russia and the United States, in part because of the good relations. Now, as we've already discussed, the relationship between the United States and Israel really is values-based. Israel is part of the West. The relationship with Russia is more interest-based, but nevertheless has flourished over the past several years. And I think this provides a basis for a trilateral conversation. Now, very, very quickly, what would the agenda be? What would these two countries talk about? I think at the top of the list should be sort of the regional security architecture, or what the vision is for the new strategic equilibrium in the Middle East. Now, it's clear that Russia enjoys a good tactical working relationship with the Iranians at this point. But from my discussions in Moscow with various people, I think it's quite clear that Russia has no interest in Iran dominating the Middle East. They want a multipolar environment in the Middle East. And so I think there's room for discussion with Washington, with Jerusalem, about how we would manage an equilibrium over the longer term. What would it look like? And how should the United States and Russia in particular act as outside powers to foster the development of a sustainable equilibrium? Second issue, obvious one, is Iran nuclear. I think none of our countries has an interest in Iran developing a nuclear weapon. We look at the situation, obviously, in radically different ways. But I think there is room for at least a discussion about how we constrain Iran's nuclear ambitions. And then finally, terrorism. Again, we all have an interest in dealing with this issue in an effective way. We have different definitions of terrorism. We don't identify the same groups as terrorists in the Middle East. But a discussion that would help us better understand the perspectives of the other side, of what the room would be for, if not joint action, at least parallel actions to deal with international terrorism would be a good start. And finally, we could talk about the Eastern Mediterranean, an area of increasing preoccupation for all three of our countries, where we need to sort out our views and what the possibilities are going forward. So finally, let me say, as I started, I don't think this is a conversation to be had at the official level, but certainly this is something that I think we pursued quite constructively among experts from our three countries. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed. Follow up your words. I can say that bridge building is a serious challenge, and each bridge has a lot of support elements. And Tom, you speak about practical steps, and I have a question to our Israel colleagues, later to Mr. Barabanov. Can the state of affairs in the Middle East or this region be corrected by joint efforts of Russia and Israel, or more likely a broader alliance is needed? And how this process could be managed? What should we do? Who is first? Maybe Mark is first. Will be first.
So I'm not sure I have a total answer to your question, but I will give a partial answer. What was said, I agree with, that the Israel-Russian relations are good. And in many ways, the test case for that is Syria. Yes, when my colleague talks about the phone and that we've successfully built deconfliction, where we found a way that Russian and Israeli interests don't have to clash directly. This is a major success. It was not preordained. It took serious work by both the Russian and the Israeli leaderships to reach a situation where Israel can defend itself and look after its strategic interests in Syria. And at the same time, Russia has its interests protected. My question is this, and I follow on the point made by Ofer. Is it possible to upgrade this? So we have deconfliction, that's good. Is it possible to build something now that the situation in Syria is moving on, that we are moving into a post-civil war situation? Is it possible to find a situation which both takes into account Israel's national security needs and respects Russia's unique position in Syria, that we can build a future which is good for Russia, good for Israel, and of course, good for Syria? Now, we would see such a future, including the absence of Iran. From my perspective, we can have the Iranians have a huge, big victory celebration in Damascus, and they should go home. But if Syria is to have a better future, a more peaceful future, with development well, before development, reconstruction, yes, and trying to get the country back in there. Is it possible that Russia can play a role here with Israel once again to upgrade the communication between us, to try to build a better situation in Syria, one that respects both Russia's interests and Israel's interests, and is ultimately good for Syria too? I think the question is open on this issue, but I would think we would be irresponsible if we didn't try seriously to do something along these lines. I actually think, and I could be wrong, but I actually think on the Iranian issue, it was said before me by someone smarter than me that we are agreeing to disagree. Actually, on this issue in Syria, is it possible that we can find a convergence of interest that would be very, very significant for both our countries and possibly bring benefits to both our countries? I leave it as a question.
Let me just add a couple of points, both to what was presented as the agenda for these possible discussions, and maybe that'll help us tie together, because of course we're going to solve every problem in our discussion here. One is the situation in Lebanon. Okay, Lebanon is decomposing before our eyes, and that could set not only the Middle East. I mean, they could set the whole Middle East, but definitely the Syria, Israel, Lebanon triangle, with the Russians, of course, being there and having great interests there. That could set the whole thing on fire inadvertently, and this has happened more than once. So, and the other point, of course, is economics, which always can serve as a means to create mutual benefit. And I say, if President Putin, when he discusses or has discussed so far the future of Syria, for example, in Astana, and he did this with President Erdogan of Turkey and President Rouhani, the former president of Iran, but not with the Israelis, and I'm not even saying the Israelis necessarily in the room, but the Israeli interest on the table. Once we include things like Lebanon and economics in there, so we already have 5 points to discuss, and Israel should be there, because Israel, as far as Lebanon and economics, for example, not to say Iran, of course, is a major player. All of a sudden, we have this wide field that we can discuss and create mutually beneficial agreements or points of discussion, so that really we could help, first of all, stabilize the region and be mutually beneficial to each other.
Thank you very much, Professor Barabanov.
Yes, I agree, and me personally, I support the idea of continuing the trilateral dialogue between the US, Israel, and Russia on the regional issues and on the broader issues. But in fact, just now we are starting or continuing the expert trilateral dialogue. If the panel will be posted on the web openly, I think it would be quite useful to continue it. But in what Russia could be interested to promote this trilateral kind of dialogue and made it not only expert, but I think political as well, is there are some official Russian proposals on confidence-building measures on the Gulf and larger in the Middle East. Sure, it looks like Helsinki 2, it looks like OSCE 2 with regional specifics, and there were not too much positive reaction on these proposals when they were promoted. But at least basing on this, not only on this, it's a rational proposal. The US might have its own ones. The Israeli politicians might have their own ones, but what we already achieved in Syria, it's a very good confidence building measures. This red phone, as the colleague said, between the Russian and Israeli military. And we all agree that this kind, at least of this red phone, would be useful I don't think that it will be posted tomorrow between Jerusalem and Tehran, but if there will be one, I think it will be a good confidence building measure. And if our trilateral dialogue could contribute to this, it would be good. And there is the last point, a funny one. I repeat, when I was reading some latest Russian newspaper articles on Israel this morning, it was an interesting thing that almost every time when Russia and Israel have something serious bilaterally, or the summit, or the important bilateral meeting, at the same day or immediately after, there was an example when there was the Israeli foreign minister in Moscow a year or a couple of years ago. At the same day, there were the Hezbollah representatives in Moscow. At another point, at the same day, there was the telephone call of the Iranian foreign minister to Moscow. But I just have to quote the Israeli ambassador in Moscow, Ambassador Ben Tzvi, who said that it's a mere coincidence. So we cannot think on the double game here. But seriously speaking, we understand that Russia have another dialogue with the Muslim countries of the region, with Iran as well, with Turkey as well. And maybe it will be just a plus, just a strength on the Russian side in if we continue our trilateral dialogue, that Russia will be able to speak simultaneously with Iran, with Syria, with Turkey, with some of Arabian countries. And in that sense, I agree that for the Astana triangle, Turkey, Russia, Iran, it would be quite difficult to find a fourth place for Israel because the Iranians would not agree absolutely. But taking two simultaneous dialogues together would be quite useful, and I think we can also start on this. And maybe the very last point, Tom Graham mentioned the climate change, and now after the Glasgow conference, we have many. We all need the strategies on green investments, I would say, yeah. To restructure our energy sectors, to build the hydrogen energy sector, and so on. And in that sense, I'm sure that Russia and Israel will strengthen our bilateral economic talks on green investments. But I think why not? We could discuss it in trilateral level with the United States as well, because there are at least some things that will be useful for all three countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ambassador Jeffrey, especially, for instance, what do you think about future United States behavior, political position? Is the United States ready to join for such kind of dialogue? If yes, on what terms?
Good question. First of all, Jeffrey, not necessarily the US government, as a former career diplomat, always believes on open channels, always believes in maximum putting cards on the table and building trust, personal relationships, avoiding misunderstandings. The difference between me and many people who advocate that is, I don't think that overcomes basic geostrategic problems. I think it makes basic geostrategic problems much more able to be dealt with in a rational manner without surprises, collapses, crises, and other things that could be avoided. But you still have the underlying basic geostrategic problems. They're not resolved by simply hotlines. We have our own hotline with the Russians in Syria, and that doesn't mean we have advanced on that front. Now, having good relations and shared views on certain issues, be it climate, be it Iranian nuclear weapons, does not only serve those tactical purposes, but develop a larger sense of trust, and that becomes a sunk cost that people want to preserve. Thus, for example, between Israel and Russia, there is certainly far less interference on the part of Russia in the internal affairs of Israel than we perceive in the United States. And from the Russian side, I'm sure that they do not think that Israel has tried to interfere, or change the domestic situation in Russia, unlike the attitude towards the United States, fair or not. In terms of cooperation, be it on Syria or on these wider questions of a geostrategic change in the region, a couple of points. One, I'm very much in favor of talking with Russia and involving Israel as well as other countries, but you have to do this, as we just heard by Oleg, in various different baskets, because of countries don't get along with each other. It's not just Iran and Israel, it's the bad relations still between Israel and Turkey, even though objectively they're both major players in Syria with some overlapping interests. So you can do this, and I still think that this administration, the Biden administration, will eventually get around to talking seriously with Russia again on Syria, and I think that there is a possible way forward. We came close when Pompeo met with President Putin in Sochi in May of 2019. More generally, though, and this gets to the point of a geostrategic shift in the region, a Gulf OSCE. I've seen the ideas from the Russian Foreign Ministry and Vitaly Namkin and others. Here's the problem, to be honest. There is a security order in the United States. However shaky it's been under the last few presidents and whatever problems it is based upon a collective security system led by the United States. We have 50,000 troops. We spend $10 billion a year in security assistance. We have troops and bases in 11 countries, counting Turkey and in Israel in the country, not our own bases, but places where we are. And that is a security system. And we are very concerned about maintaining that security system, as are our partners and allies. That forms the framework within which we, the United States, and our partners and allies will respond to things like a regional OSCE for the region. To some degree, we will respond to that a bit like Russia has responded to US ideas and European ideas for integration of Caucasus and near abroad countries such as Ukraine and Belarus into the larger European family with suspicion and some concern. That's simply the way it is. I don't think that's going to change. The key problem, frankly, is Iran. If Russia wants a multilateral OSCE kind of deal, and I worked on the OSCE, I know the details pretty well, for the region, objectively, you have to some degree, enable a bigger role for Iran in the region. But to quote Henry Kissinger, Iran, I'm misquoting Henry Kissinger, and Graham might change. Iran is more a cause in the region than it is a state. And until it acts like a state, any effort to enhance its role in order to create a balance of competing nations, Russia, US, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, Iran, is going to run afoul of our concerns. Now, I say this as a private speaker. Frankly, the Biden administration hasn't figured all of this out yet, but the trajectory of where it is going, thud in the night, quietly, I think will get them to where other administrations have been. And I think eventually this will limit Israel's ability to work with Russia, because at some point, Israel will have to decide whether it likes the current security system in the region, or it is going to weigh in for something different and something that is going to reduce the role of the United States. Again, we'll have to see. It may be that this administration will conclude that it doesn't want a big role in the United States, but it just finished its defense review with no decision on reducing forces in the Middle East. So I wouldn't hold our breath for a change in American policy. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Tom, are you satisfied discussion about your ideas? And question. Let's imagine United States is very busy. Can Russia, Israel, and other regional countries can operate without the United States to reach agreement, to live on their own? Is it possible or not today in reality?
Well, it's a very good question, Andrei, but I would build on what Jim Jeffries has just said. I mean, the United States is engaged in the region. We do have a collective security arrangement that has worked quite well over the years. I think it's quite clear that at the strategic level, the United States would like to focus more of its resources on East Asia, specifically dealing with the challenge, that strategic challenge we perceive coming from China, that is going to last for years, if not decades, across a very broad front. But the United States, while it's reassessing its global position, is not going to abandon the Middle East. It's still an important element in our foreign policy thinking. It has implications for the way we deal with proliferation issues, terrorism, obviously energy at this point. But I think it's also clear that Russia has returned to the Middle East in a significant way, and a much more active geopolitical player than it had been for, say, the period of the 1980s, 1990s, and indeed into the 2000s, and something that the United States has to recognize. Israel is probably our key partner in the region. I think we appreciate the fact that it does enjoy a good working relationship with the Russians. I appreciate the views of our Israeli colleagues, particularly about the need to upgrade the relationship with Russia to advance their own interests, but also to ensure that Russia's legitimate concerns are taken into account. The only point I would stress here is that as Israel moves in that direction, it's going to need to remain in very close contact with the United States, because as Jim Jeffrey said, I mean, you could cross a line where you have to choose between an American-led collective security arrangement in the Middle East, or move to something that is perhaps more along the lines of what the Russians are proposing at this point. That situation, I believe, makes it even more important that we continue a trilateral dialogue to begin to understand what is at stake, what the various views of the various countries are, and in particular, how we're going to manage the role of Iran in the Middle East. One of the ways we got to an OSCE arrangement in Europe in the 1970s was a very explicit or deliberate decision on the part of the United States to treat the Soviet Union then not as a cause, but as a geopolitical great power that provided a basis for serious negotiation. I don't know if we're there. We're certainly not there with Iran right now. Whether we can get there over the next several years is, I think, a fundamental question of how we're going to continue to organize the Middle East over the long term, and whether we can find an equilibrium that satisfies the interest of the major powers in the region, starting with Israel, but also including the two major outside powers, Russia and the United States.
Thank you very much indeed, colleagues. We are close to the final of our discussion, but it seems to me we have 2-3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes, maybe some last comments. Colleagues, short, very brief comments. If not, I would like to say thank you very much indeed. It seems to me the discussion, it's very nice discussion, but and finally, I can say that what we need is divine providence in this region, because without external forces and situation is not very optimistic, unfortunately. But I hope our discussion will be useful for our common mutual understanding of situation and each other. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
See
you.
you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.